Alrighty, we're recording. Hey, I'm Thomas Cox, and this is ISSDG meeting number 9. It's the July 2019 session, and we're going to have originally we were hoping to have an overview of the Wharton Crypto Governance Workshop's outputs, and as it turns out, that won't be quite what I'm giving you. I'm going to give you something that I created for my own use that's heavily influenced by that work, but the Wharton Crypto Governance workshop group is continuing to refine their work product on a weekly basis. We're meeting on Mondays now, and which is great, I think, for the output, but it means we're not in a position to show it as a static thing. But I have built my own thing on it or inspired by it that I did want to share that I think will be relevant and useful for this audience. Before I do that, let me start screen sharing, and we will have a quick round of introductions. First off, you're seeing here on screen the Lucid meeting. We run all of our ISSDG meetings using Lucid meetings, which means all of our minutes are available online for members of ISSDG to review, and that includes links to slides and recordings of all past meetings. In addition, we have an ISSDG channel, which has our November, December, and all the way through our most recent June meeting. Max Semenchuk telling us about the DGov Foundation. And so all past sessions are visible here. And I want to mention our ISSDG membership. So if you're a member, and I think everyone on this call is, but you're not listed here, by golly, give me your headshot and we'll put you in here. I'm Thomas Cox, the president. My day job is Chief Governance Officer at strongblock.io. Alistair Berger's on the call, is our organization secretary. He's a PhD candidate and researcher at RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. RMIT, of course, being the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, heavy hitters in the blockchain governance world. Also, Thiago Canelas and Brandon Espinoza are longtime members. And so is Jason Potts of RMIT, Chris Berg of RMIT, who, by the way, Chris joined me at the Wharton workshop. So he and I both worked on that work product along with 23 other folks. And Anouk Pinchetti, and would love to add Denise McCurdy, for instance, on here. Denise is on the call. Hello, Denise. And as soon as I get your headshot, I'll steal one off of LinkedIn unless you've got a better one, and we'll get you up here so you get credit.
LinkedIn is good. And I'm happy to join. I think you need some women here.
We have actually a decent amount, and always welcome more of any gender, as a matter of fact. So yes, please, thank you. We have no dues, so by the act of saying you'd like to join, you're in.
Okay.
And I will mark you here as present for purposes of attendance. Right, here's the keynote presentation by me, and I will go into full screen mode, and I ask you to let me know, is it still up? It's not doing the sharing the way I expected. I'm going to share a different window, the full screen window. Okay, visible? Yes?
Yes.
Blockchain Governance Framework, 29 July 2019, yes?
Yes, that's visible.
That's
awesome.
good.
Right, so I want to frame this up with some context. This presentation is really trying to address a more specific question than the Wharton work was addressing. My question is, if you were creating a new blockchain system, whether for a consortium or for the public, what questions would you ask in order to better set up your decentralized governance prior to launch? And I will absolutely give credit to the Wharton group. This is inspired by recent work with the Wharton Crypto Governance Workshop. And I want to stress that the following slides are not a summary of the output of the workshop, and they've not been reviewed by or endorsed by Wharton or any of the other members who attended. That's my own. All the errors are mine. All the good bits are from them. But first, we always like to start off with what is governance to make sure we're on the same page here, because it's very easy to get off on the wrong foot if we aren't clear. I claim that governance is a system for managing a collective, and for doing it by providing for 1, decision making, and number 2, decision execution, and number 3, amending the decision making and execution processes and rules. So I mentioned collective. Great. What's a collective? What's a governed collective? I claim a collective, such as a multi-node, multi-user blockchain, is any group where the following facts are true. The users wish to make decisions, yet the cost of unanimity is high, and the cost of not deciding is also high. Therefore, all members unanimously agree to allow, for at least some, less than unanimous choices to be binding on all members. And that's how, and if you don't have a collective, a lot of what we're talking about is not relevant. Because if you can get unanimity, you don't need governance. Everyone says yes, and then you just make it happen. And if you have a dictator, again, you don't need governance particularly, although you might still have some. What's a framework? A framework is a system for structuring and organizing a complex creation. And in particular, a framework has a philosophy or embodies the philosophy of whoever made it, whoever uses it and refines it over time. And a framework is relevant in the context of a class of problems. The upside of a framework is it does provide a common approach, language, structure, and some guidance on how to proceed while allowing you to customize your actual solution. And it also assists users with the complexity of the domain they're working in. Some examples are the MVC model, it's called the Model, Views, and Controller approach to programming. And I would also claim that Jungian archetypes are a framework, a way of looking at the complex system of the human mind and human dreams. So governance has at least 2 challenges around legitimacy and effectiveness. This is part of a much larger diagram I drew for myself to try and get my thoughts straight, and it stood out for me as relevant to share. Legitimacy and effectiveness must be considered early on in design because what the research shows or seems to show that when users won't experience the governance as legitimate if they aren't familiar with it. Even if the governance is simple and fair and established and follows all the whatever makings of other governance systems that they may know, if they aren't familiar with the governance processes, they'll treat the whole thing as illegitimate. So I claim that part of onboarding people to a new system would be forcing them to use the governance mechanisms themselves early and often so that they become familiar and known and trusted. Another part of the dance between legitimacy and effectiveness is that users will come to despise institutions that turn out to be weak and ineffective. So any legitimacy that they were perceived to have earlier can be sucked away. So you can have an institution that has this subjective and ephemeral attribute called legitimacy, and it can be lost through a lack of effectiveness. And at the same time, if you start off eroding legitimacy, people will start to resist or undermine the institution, and that can make them ineffective, which then makes them even more illegitimate, which makes them even more ineffective in a downward spiral. So attacking either of these two hurts both, is my point. What is governance effectiveness? Well, governance institutions and automation, if you have automated governance, have to work as promised for them to be considered effective. They have to address legitimate needs, and I will add in a legitimate way. And they have to not cause extra problems, or at least not too many extra problems. And ideally be amendable. This, I think, might be exhaustive. It is certainly necessary and might be sufficient. A bit more on governance legitimacy. I'm going to claim that all modern governance structures and or agents require a belief by the governed that the governance structure or agent is acting appropriately, staying within norms, and addressing key needs. And if all three are true, then people will tend to have some confidence and faith in that thing. And legitimacy in the literature usually flows from one of three sources: tradition, charismatic legitimacy, or rational-legal. And your traditional legitimacy is kings and queens and the Pope. It's what my great-grandparents it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. It's the way we've always done it around here. It's how things are done. For charismatic, my examples are, of course, Napoleon and Vitalik Buterin, because I think we all think charisma when we think Vitalik. And rational legal is the system of consent of the governed, following agreed procedures, following the rules. And any one or a mix of those, I think rational legal with a good dose of a patina of tradition laid over it seems to give some stability. And people tend to believe the things that they are very, very familiar with through tradition and that hold up to rational legal tests. A warning about governance legitimacy and algorithms. I was recently piqued by an article called Algorithmic Governance and Political Legitimacy by Matthew Crawford, who points out that, yes, agents do tend to abuse power, and so, yes, principals do bind their agents with rules, and that's a liberal proceduralism tradition dating back to the English Revolution. Thank you, English Revolution. And algorithmic judgment tends to resemble liberal proceduralism quite nicely, which makes people comfortable with it because it looks like what they know. But, he points out, A, it places authority beyond scrutiny. Unless you can read source code, and even then it may not be obvious what's really going on. And secondly, and even more chillingly, the judgments that come out of algorithms are often inexplicable even by the programmers or by the code itself. And it is in fact a feature of modern artificial intelligence built on neural networks that they themselves can't explain what their own reasoning was for how they came up with the answers they came up with. And one can argue that humans make up stories about what they do that may or may not make sense, but we do sort of expect that in our agents. It's like, so you took this deduction, why? Or you moved your pawn here for a reason. What's your theory here? What are you thinking? And modern AI systems pointedly can't do that. It's a known feature or bug or attribute of those systems. So this is concerning when it comes to blockchain governance. Something to think about. Of course, I have the link to the underlying journal article. It's a paywall site. You get 2 free articles for free every month. So I made a PDF of the article, which I will share with my friends. But you shouldn't need that because you should probably not have seen this site, and you can go get your free article. So I've come up with what I propose as a governance design process for setting up governance for a new blockchain system via these steps. Number 1 would be identify the founding stakeholders before you open this thing up for your full consortium or for the public or whatever. Figure out who's in. Set up a purpose for the new blockchain system, because a lot of the questions that get asked later on have to do with the purpose that you're creating the system for. Is it Monero? Is it, anonymous cash transfers? Is it, Bitcoin that's going to undermine central banks? What's the purpose here? Number 3, define your target stakeholders and their interests. Is it the Maersk chain, and you're going to invite shippers, shipping agents, and operators of large ships around the world, and customers who want to move stuff on those ships, and insurers and bankers and whoever. Then you want to define your governance powers, processes, and institutions. I have the beginnings of a list of detailed questions in there, which I'll touch on. And then you want to set up governance mechanisms in code. And here there be dragons. But I've got a little bit of guidance to offer there. Let's talk about stakeholders and interests. I figure you can do numbers 1 and 2 here all on your own. You don't need my help to figure out who your founding stakeholders are, what your purpose is. But then your target stakeholders and interests. You might ask what classes of stakeholders are anticipated. And of course, additional classes you didn't anticipate may arise through usage. So these could be token holders, developers, and dApp users. That's a common trio that's referenced on the EOS mainnet. Oh, along with block producers, that's a 4th group. Is there a 5th? I could probably think of one. But these are the classes you anticipate. And for each of those classes, what interests do they share and do not share? For instance, on Bitcoin, users of the system would like fees to stay low, but miners would like the fees to be high. It's just natural. See, it's not evil and broken. It's just, let's think about that up front. And then how might power be allocated amongst those stakeholders to prevent harmful concentrations of power? Not all concentrations, but harmful concentrations. For instance, on the EOS mainnet today, because large token holders have all control over who becomes a block producer, and because very few of those large holders are actually voting, the ones who are free to misbehave, and specifically they are voting in their friends and themselves into block producer status and collecting the payments that come to block producers. And for those who they vote in that aren't themselves, they are apparently extracting rent from them. They're selling their votes. They're selling access to the block producer role, which means that if you want to be a block producer, you got to pay kickbacks. And the best producers who do the most tangible benefits for that network in terms of helping users, developing code, providing outreach, aren't on that list. They're off doing real work. It's the sycophants and fairly useless bump on a log producers who are willing to pay money, and they keep their expenses extremely low by doing nothing useful other than making blocks, and they don't all do that very well. So it's a real problem on the EOS mainnet, and it's getting worse. There's a harmful concentration of power for you. Another thing to think about is inclusion and exclusion. How are different classes of stakeholders included or excluded from various aspects of the system, right? Should token holders be the only ones who select block producers? Should other groups be allowed to select a subset of block producers? Should block producers be forbidden from certain activities? How do individuals join the network? How do individuals join a specific class of stakeholders, if indeed you have classes identified? How do they leave the network voluntarily? Is there an easy mechanism? Is it straightforward? How do they get ejected involuntarily, and why? Or can they? You'd also want to ask what powers must be exercised for the system to operate as designed. Obviously, if it's a blockchain, you have to have somebody producing blocks, and there must be consensus amongst those producers on what finality is. So that seems like a minimum. Then producers must have producers or validators must be selected somehow. Is it randomness? Is it proof of work? Is it through stake-weighted voting? But somehow those producers have to be identified. And what else? Is there dispute resolution? Is there more sophisticated activity going on? Some of the more recent chains that have come out have very sophisticated systems embedded in their overall governance framework. And this is where you'd introduce those and identify them. A worker proposal system to pay for additional development. I know of one chain that's considering having an inspector general role that will issue reports on block producers as an independent third party, just providing information to voters. Once you've identified all the powers you'd like, are there any processes to exercise those powers? And what institutions will be created to carry out the processes to exercise the powers, if any? Something like Bitcoin is so incredibly wonderfully simple that there are no quote-unquote institutions. There's just hash power. And that doesn't mean institutions haven't arisen, the Bitcoin Foundation, the core developer procedures and so forth, but those are human creations around the periphery of the chain supporting it. They're not defined in the governance of the chain a priori, I don't think. A bit more on defining powers. You might ask which of these powers need to be present for your system to operate. Is there a policy making function? Is there a policy carrying out function, a legislature and an executive? Do policies need to be interpreted in special cases or specific cases? In which case you need some kind of judicial or arbitration function. You might need an inquiry and investigation power, whether that's if you've got an open chain, that's probably not too hard. But if you've got a commercial network in particular where transactions are obfuscated so that your competitors who are in the consortium with you can't see who your customers are or what prices you're charging them, you may still need to have some sort of zero knowledge proof capability to satisfy regulatory compliance that you're not, say, violating some consent decree you entered into. And you'd like to use a zero knowledge proof rather than just unencrypting all of your transactions and sharing them with the agency that's regulating you, because who's to say they don't leak it? There'll probably be a pass in your definition where you set up incentive mechanisms. Super. So what behaviors should be incentivized and disincentivized? And how are you going to do that? And what are the mechanisms that you'll use to cause participants to have skin in the game that's appropriate? And what side effects can be anticipated from the disincentivization or incentivization schemes? So here are the next steps as I see them. The Wharton work is continuing to be refined every week. They're up now to 20. It was originally about 15 or 16 questions. We're up to 25 questions across 6 categories. That's growing. We're working on it every week. At some point, it will be to a stable enough place that it'll get shared out more broadly. This framework of mine is also being refined. And there is a classification project that's on hold currently to apply the Wharton Network Governance Disclosure Questionnaire to existing blockchain projects. And it's here at this link, the DAO landscape, and I'll show you what that page looks like. It looks like this. And it is a fairly old by now overview of a bunch of what were then all the most common blockchains and how they stacked up from a governance perspective. And rather than invent a new place to stick this new analysis, I elected to work with Max Semenchuk and Lane Rettig on updating this document. But it's on hold because the Wharton questions are still in flux. And if you guys got questions, that would be great. I'll take them now. And I also want to invite people to email me or Telegram me or Twitter me questions if they're watching the recording. And with that, I will pause. I will show you really quickly, though, on screen the a quick flyby. Again, this thing's in total flux, but I wanted you to at least see it. The Wharton questions that I mentioned. And you can see it's being looked at by a whole bunch of people already right now. There are 25 editors, and there's all sorts of, margin notes and questions going on, and lots of redlining. And as I mentioned, yeah, let's just say that there's a lot there. So please don't pause and take screenshots. It's all going to change. But when it's more settled, it absolutely will be shared, and I look forward to that eventuality. And with that, our next step in our agenda, which I will put on screen now, our next step is, of course, to invite your feedback and questions. And I want to acknowledge that we do have a fairly light turnout today, and that's expected. And the reason for that is we just had a terrible time scheduling the presentation, and none of the open times in the second and third week of the month worked for enough people. So I just elected to do a solo fly through of this material today so that we wouldn't miss July entirely. And I don't know yet if it'll be dark in August. We do have a September speaker lined up. So with that, I invite feedback and Q&A. Alistair, you can go first if you'd like, and then Denise, and you don't have to stick to the 3 to 5 minutes. We've got a little more time than that.
All right. Great. Thanks very much for that presentation, Thomas. And it's very nice to be back. I haven't been here for a number of sessions, I should say. So it's very nice to be back.
It's good to have you.
Thank you very much. So just briefly on your presentation, so that's really interesting. So it's really good just to frame, I know it's a framework, but it's also very good to frame the sorts of questions that that people should be thinking about when they're thinking about governance, whether it pertains to a blockchain protocol or just whether it pertains to governance, full stop. Just briefly on a slightly tangential note, but it's always very interesting for me to hear you talk about governance as well, because what you refer to as governance is often just referred to as institutions as well. So I'm constantly thinking back to, yes, this is just institutions. So this is just a semantic thing that, of course, in a lot of political science and political economy, of course, I'm sure you know, Thomas, that in some circumstances, people just refer to this stuff as institutions, but nonetheless, it basically pertains to the same thing. So what was striking me quite a bit with your framework was I'm seeing a lot of crossover with the Ostrom Commons framework as well. So it almost seems like you are building an analogous framework for a blockchain commons or what you're referring to as a collective. So that's very interesting in itself. But some specific things which struck me as they could be worth thinking about, and it looks like you are thinking about this already, but what about things like as to flexibility as to how it relates to all aspects of the framework? So this is things like flexibility as to even the aims of the purpose of your blockchain protocol, the purpose and the aims as it relates to all aspects of your framework. So what we've seen in historical circumstances is successful constitutional arrangements have tended to be really, really flexible. So even the different governance arrangements that have been put in place have evolved over time. So, for example, the Supreme Court in the United States of America, which some of you might know very well, their general purpose wasn't really put into concrete terms until about 16 years after the Revolutionary War. So, of course, there was a case, I think it was Madison versus Madison, where they basically established that they could decree executive acts and acts of legislation to be unconstitutional. So it took them a long time to actually figure out what they were doing and what they were for. So the founding fathers obviously had a rough idea that we needed a Supreme Court. We needed the highest court in a land to do something judicial, perhaps. But it wasn't until 16 years later that they actually figured out, yes, this is what we are for, and this is what the Supreme Court's for. And it's been largely successful. Of course, we can have plenty of arguments about the role of the Supreme Court currently and the role of the Supreme Court in the past, but for the last 250 odd years, it's largely been successful. I think it's really important to just certainly build into these frameworks an aspect of flexibility. And that's an aspect of flexibility over all aspects of that framework. And I suppose on the other side of the coin, which can also be useful to think about, is that flexibility can also be in some ways detrimental. So I guess using the same analogy, if we look again to the United States, again, it's just a really good example, the United States Constitution, but other institutions can evolve to be detrimental. So you can look at things like the imperial presidency, so the role of executive power. Again, this is something that you can certainly argue about, but it's certainly evolution and flexibility in constitutional design and constitutional enactment can also be detrimental as well. So yeah, I think that's basically it for me, but I think it's just important to sort of build flexibility into all aspects of this thinking. But yeah, fantastic presentation. Thanks, Thomas.
Super. Thank you very much, Alistair. And yes, I'm taking notes. Super. Denise, would love to get any thoughts and feedback you've got, questions, reactions, anything at all.
Okay. First of all, I agree. This was excellent. Thank you. I really like how you presented some foundational definitions of governance, collective, framework. I think you have to start there, because if people don't have a common understanding, even at that level, it's really difficult then to move in the same direction. So I think that's excellent. Something that Alistair said actually that made me think. So Alistair, when you're talking about the supreme government and flexibility, you know, we call it the elastic clause, AKA the necessary and proper clause, right? That was originally intended for future generations to do what they think is necessary, because of course the founding fathers couldn't articulate everything right back then, nor can we in any governance situation. So I'm just sort of thinking of how we need to incorporate an elastic clause with the inability of AI to understand how and why it works. And Thomas, that was in one of your one of the first slides, and I thought that was really interesting. So I'm like, okay, we're going to have to build in some sort of an elastic clause, or Alistair, to your point, flexibility. We're going to need to. There's just way too many moving parts with technology that is actually moving in the opposite direction. So I just think it's going to be interesting to see how this, I don't have any answers, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves.
Super. Anything else stand out to your mind as either you liked it, or maybe you go, huh, what, or it just confused you?
It didn't confuse me. I thought it was very clear. And again, I think it was foundational. I guess with the ongoing work with Wharton, you know, it's then taking it to the next steps to say, okay, here's the foundations, here's where we're going, here's what we mean by this, and then getting into the next layer of, and, you know, what are examples of this, and how do we do this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts, Alistair?
Yeah, I agree with that, Denise. So, by the way, very nice to meet you, Denise. Especially your opening comments from your feedback. I think it's so important to have a common language because there is so much literature in this broad area of governance, or this broad area of institutions, depending on what school of thought you're in, and depending on what language you are using. But a common language is so important. So. I mean, it sounds like that this Wharton work is going to be just super important and super useful for allowing people to be talking about the same thing and talking about the same problems. Yeah,
the Wharton folks are contemplating a glossary specifically in the context of the document itself, just so it has its own internal integrity. Not that others need to adopt that language, but at least it has a language. And we're aware of National Institutes of Standards and Technology, the OSI, which is I guess the International Standards Organization, but in French, and then the IEEE are all working on standards. In fact, I'm on the IEEE standards group, so I see a grand convergence happening. I hope sooner rather than later, because while standards move slowly, the rest of us move quickly, and we could really use some standard language, I think. But that's probably for another day. Anything else on this presentation?
Possible to get access to this?
Of course.
Yeah, because you know, and Alistair, you may or may not do, but I'm also a PhD candidate, and my topic, my dissertation is governance and blockchain.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, fantastic.
So I will credit everyone appropriately. Okay, if I use any of your thoughts, you'll see.
Brilliant. Super. Yeah, Denise, I'll make sure to give a link to this recording and a link to a PDF of the slides that I showed. Will go up into our Lucid meeting. Lucid has all of our minutes. It has all the PDFs of all the slides are uploaded there. And I almost always include in the minutes or in the email that I send a link out to the YouTube channel, which has all the presentations, all the recordings.
Thank you.
Super. Okay, and with that, I'm going to move us on to the open table discussion. Again, I'll share screen really briefly. And so this is also an open discussion format. Just typically it's 1 to 2 minutes. And what I'm asking for is, hey, you know, anything for the good of the organization that you'd like to suggest, future topics, future speakers. We have nobody lined up for August. I'm thinking, Denise, you might be in a position to brief folks on at least what questions you're asking and how you're asking them, perhaps. And we have Angela Walsh tentatively for Deconstructing Decentralization in September. And we've not really come to finality with our sponsorship program idea. So if anybody has anything to say on any of those topics, Alistair, you first, then Denise.
All right. Well, having heard your presentation, Thomas, I'm very keen to hear more about what is happening at Wharton and also what has just happened at Wharton. I understand Chris was supposed to do a presentation, but he wasn't able to. So it'd be nice if we can push that. So and I can obviously help do that as well. But Denise, I'd love to hear about your PhD as well. So that is certainly another good topic, which I'd be very interested to hear about. So those are probably my two suggestions, which are just seconding your suggestions.
I'm fine. I think they're good questions. Really good suggestions. Happy to
so
be seconded.
I'm very keen for both of those.
Super. Denise, thoughts?
Agree completely. Well, on both. Agree completely on the first. I'd love to see more output from Wharton as it becomes available, especially output through the lens of governance and I guess this team's perspective on that output. So definitely count me in on that. I'm happy to speak in August. Of course, my research is still ongoing, but happy to do that. I can share the questions and can certainly share some overarching themes that are being uncovered. And Alistair, again, it's just so I know Thomas knows this, but it's all about, I'm working with automotive, I'm working with the legal, I'm working with different industries and asking them the same block of questions, all in blockchain governance.
Great. Fantastic.
Yeah, and we might be able to get you some more inputs from our extended networks as well. And I think people should know that you're doing this work.
Oh, I'd love that if you can. Yeah, if anyone doesn't mind spending an hour with me, that would be brilliant because it's very helpful for my research.
Super. Okay, I'm going to pencil Denise you in for being our August speaker, probably around the 15th to the 20th, somewhere in that window. I'm not quite even sure what that is. We'll sort that out offline. And if there's no other topics to talk about, I'm going to move us on to my President's Minute, in which I just say, hey, the schedule is now looking like Denise McCurdy in August. And I just mentioned our September speaker on the prior slide, and I didn't memorize it, but it's about decentralization. And when I close the meeting, everyone who's connected to Lucid will be prompted with a feedback form. Please fill the feedback form out. It's very, very helpful. And I definitely want to see us doing a little bit more formalization of our membership, probably by the end of the year, early next year, possibly dues. And we have bylaws, actually. We have a legal entity in the state of Oregon, because that's where I live. And so there's a little more housekeeping we can start to create on that front as we get more people in and start doing more work. But we don't have to do any of that today. And with that, I open the floor for one final last call. Anything for the good of the organization? Going once. Going twice.
I'll just briefly mention there is a suggested sponsorship. It doesn't have a name. It's just a sponsorship document. Let's just call it a document for the time being. I can reshare that just so we can start that conversation perhaps over the next few sessions. But I'll reshare that.
Super. I'll take that down as an action item.
Because it would be nice to get some, whatever it turns out to be, some institutional sponsorship, some money to do something, to run something. I think there'd be some interest.
Yep. Super. So this is reshare sponsorship document. It's assigned to Alistair, and a due date. Can we have that by, say, Friday?
Oh, definitely. Yep. It'll just be an email round with a brief note. Yep.
Should be quick. In fact, if you get the link to me, I can include it in the minutes when I send those out in the next few hours. Or you can email it, whatever's easier.
Yep.
So you'll see part of the reason we use Lucid is it tracks our commitments, as well as our minutes and our membership.
Just one thing, and I'm going to throw this out there. It may not be part of the charter of Strongblock, but is it possible to have research into different, or proof of concepts into different types of governing structures to say, okay, we've looked at these 5, we've looked at these 3, and these seem to be particularly effective if you're in this type of environment.
Oh yeah, that's totally in bounds. The ISSDG charter, I should have mentioned, is we are the International Society for the Study of Decentralized Governance, and that's decentralized governance in all its forms. And we've always asked for a roughly equal mix of practitioners and academics so that we can have that fruitful exchange of real world experience and theoretical soundness. And to dip into the research, blockchains are so cross-functional and require so much interdisciplinary understanding that without academic support, we'd all be reinventing the wheel. So I love your idea, and I'd love to see that developed, and maybe we can recruit a speaker for that.
Great.
And I'm not sure how to summarize that in notes, so I'll have to put it in the afterwards. But I have one other announcement. I realize I'm going to be speaking in September in the Washington, D.C. area to the National Institute of Standards and Technology on blockchain governance. It'll probably be a version of what you saw today or something a little more refined. And at the end of October, there's a very large convention in Las Vegas called the World Crypto and Blockchain Conference. And my company, StrongBlock, has been invited to help curate the content for some of the tracks. And so I'm inviting all ISSDG members to let me know if they feel like going to Las Vegas. I have no travel money, cannot reimburse anything, but I can put you on stage, very likely. If your travel is such that you're going to be there, I probably, if I know soon, like by August 5th or so, that you're probably going to come, I will do my best to get you either a speaking opportunity or a panelist opportunity, which carries with it free admission. And so that's calling all the friends and associates to let them know that. And with that, I will end the recording and thank everyone very, very much for participating in this edition of ISSDG. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.